My name is Madison Cole. I am 31 years old, and I learned, a long time ago, that humiliation sounds the cruelest when it is spoken politely. My brother, Jacob, proved that 3 nights before a family dinner that was supposed to celebrate his future. His message came in while I was still at my desk, and at first, it looked harmless enough. It was just another instruction from a family that had always edited me down to something easier to explain. He said I could attend the dinner with his fiance's family, but I was forbidden from claiming I was his sister. Her father was a federal judge, and Jacob told me it would be embarrassing. A few minutes later, my foster parents, Jennifer and Michael, called to smooth it over. They told me it would be best if I sat at a small staff table in the back near the service door, just for one evening, just to keep things comfortable. Welcome to Turning Tables Stories channel. I'm currently enjoying a warm cup of coffee and watching The View, a quiet contrast to the cold calculation of Madison's family. It's in these still moments that we find the clarity to stand our ground. I'd love to know, where are you watching from and what is your favorite drink right now? Settled in? Good. Because I didn't just sit, and I did not argue with them. I did not cry or ask why. Decisiveness is a much better tool for survival than despair. I simply set my phone face down on the polished wood of my desk and stared at the dark reflection in the screen for a few seconds. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. It was a balance sheet finally settling into the red. I opened my laptop and logged into the private server where I kept the final drafts of the Madisonian papers. This was the landmark research on legal reform that Jacob planned to hand to Judge David Miller tomorrow morning. He planned to present it as his own work, the crowning achievement of a career built entirely on my invisible labor. I moved the cursor to the administrative settings and changed the encryption key. Access denied. Locked. This wasn't revenge, this was accounting. My brother had been a high-interest debt I had been paying since we were children. My foster parents had built their entire lives around his curated confidence. They had poured $150,000 into private schools, social coaches, and debate camps. They provided all the scaffolding required to make a shallow man look natural in a deep room. I took a different road. I started at community college because it was the only thing I could afford. I worked 3 jobs, borrowed what I had to, and spent my nights in the library while Jacob spent his at the club. My law degree was a cycle of exhaustion and discipline. No safety net, no applause. Just the quiet understanding that if I wanted a real life, I would have to build it with my own hands. I realize now that Jacob didn't actually fear I would embarrass him. He feared the comparison. He knew that the second the light hit us both, the version of success he had been selling would look like the rented suit it actually was. I looked at the digital clock on my screen, 11:51 p.m., by 12:00 to 3 a.m. The server was locked, the backup was wiped, and the bridge was gone. Love, for my family, had always been a subscription service, and I was done footing the bill. My compassion had been a luxury they had overdrafted for years, assuming the credit was limitless. They were not going to be shocked by what they had done to me. They were going to be shocked that I had finally stopped playing along. I sat back and rubbed my eyes, trying to summon a moment of regret, but there was only clarity. I would go to that dinner. I would sit at the staff table by the service door, and I would let the room reveal exactly what happens when you try to erase the person who built your foundation. I have been the silent investor in their version of family for a very long time. For 36 consecutive months, I watched my bank account deplete by $3,000 on the first of every month. Jennifer and Michael called me reliable, but what they really meant was profitable. They sat in that pristine house, sipping expensive tea and judging my lack of social polish, while the very roof over their heads was a structure I was personally financing. They were on the brink of foreclosure 3 years ago, when Michael's bad investments finally caught up with them. I stepped in and quietly took over the mortgage, not because I felt a debt of love, but because I was still trying to buy a version of a mother and father that simply did not exist. People often look at someone in my position, a woman who has built a career out of holding the powerful accountable, and they wonder how I could let my own family put me in a corner. They see my silence as weakness. They do not understand the prison without bars. Growing up in that house was a masterclass in conditioned helplessness. It was a house with no doors, because every time I tried to reach for the handle, they would remind me of my original debt. They reminded me that they took me in when no one else would. They told me I was a phase, not a future. That narrative becomes a heavy chain. You do not realize you are a prisoner when you are the one meticulously polishing the bars. My endurance for all those years was not a lack of courage. It was a survival tactic. They used a sophisticated blend of emotional manipulation and manufactured gratitude to keep me in line, making me believe I owed them my life. I stayed because I was waiting for the Madisonian papers to be complete. I was building my own exit ramp, one legal theory at a time, until the foundation was strong enough for me to stand alone. I was a survivalist, waiting for the right moment to stop being a prop in their play. Jennifer and Michael never viewed my mortgage payments as a gift. They viewed them as a tax I owed for the privilege of being their spare. They spent their own remaining income on Jacob's $1,500,000 lifestyle, while I worked second shifts to ensure they didn't lose their social standing. I had been the invisible scaffolding for a family that was rotten at the center. But as I sat in the quiet of my office, I realized that the only person who could grant me a pardon was myself. The chains were never real. They were just stories I had been told until I started repeating them to myself. I was never the burden they claimed I was. I was the engine that kept their entire world running. And today, I finally realized that engines can be turned off. I reached for my records and prepared the balance sheet. It was time for the silent architect to submit her final invoice. The Metropolitan Club in Washington, D.C., is a place built for a specific kind of theater. It smells of history, dark wood, and the kind of quiet money that doesn't need to shout to be heard. I arrived exactly at 6 p.m., wearing a simple navy dress and understated heels. It was my armor of invisibility. I didn't walk in looking for a spotlight. I walked in looking for the exit I had already planned. The private dining room was a sea of polished brass and perfectly arranged crystal. My foster parents were already there, smiling with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. Jacob stood at the center of the room, his hand resting comfortably on the waist of his fiancée, Ashley. He wore the look of a man who believed his own fiction, a man who thought he was finally being seen by the right people. Ashley was elegant and poised, a woman who had never known what it felt like to be edited out of her own life. The second Jacob noticed me, the color in his face shifted. He crossed the room quickly, his smile remaining frozen for the benefit of the other guests. Under his breath, he told me I was late, even though I was not. Before he could say more, Ashley and her father, Judge David Miller, approached. Jacob introduced me with a level of clinical dishonesty that was almost impressive. He didn't use the word sister. He said I was a temp administrative helper who did some filing for the family. He spoke about me as if I were a piece of office equipment that had been accidentally left in the hallway. I looked him in the eye for 3 seconds longer than was comfortable, but I did not correct him. He thought my silence was an agreement to the contract of his lie. Jennifer appeared next, ushering me toward the back of the room. She told me they had saved me a special seat where it would be quieter. Quieter meant out of sight. My table was a tiny square in the far corner, a spot usually reserved for overflow guests or junior assistants who were meant to be seen but never heard. It was placed directly next to the service door, where the staff moved in and out with practiced invisibility. The smell of industrial floor cleaner from the kitchen competed with the expensive perfume of the main hall. From my vantage point, I had a perfect view of the main table. I sat down and let the room reveal its true cost. I watched my foster parents scan the room for approval, their identities entirely dependent on the status of the man they were trying to impress. They were performing a $1,500,000 masquerade. They were performing a massive 7-figure masquerade. I listened as the first round of toasts began. Jacob was being celebrated for the Madisonian papers, my research, my legal theories, my life's work. They were toasting to a brilliance that didn't belong to him. They were celebrating an elaborate fraud, while the person who had actually built that legacy was sitting by the trash bins. My brother looked giddy, as if this evening were a deposit he could draw on for the next 20 years. He had no idea that the account was already empty. I sat at that tiny square table and watched the condensation on my water glass drip onto the cheap linen. The industrial hum of the kitchen behind me was a rhythmic reminder of exactly where my family thought I belonged. In the main hall, the air was thick with the self-congratulatory chatter of people who believed that proximity to power was the same thing as possessing it. My foster parents were leaning into the conversation at the main table, Michael's laughter sounding a little too desperate, a little too loud. I could see the sweat on Michael's brow. I knew this dinner was their last-ditch effort, a final performance funded by the very last of their credit limit, hoping a connection with the judge would save them from the foreclosure notice waiting on their kitchen counter. Jacob was in his element, gesturing broadly as he held court, likely reciting a line I had written for him 3 weeks ago. Then, Judge David Miller stood up. He had a personal tradition that was well known in these circles, a bit of old-fashioned hospitality that he used to measure a room. He took a silver tray of champagne flutes from a passing server and began to make a slow, deliberate circuit of the tables. He was greeting guests, offering a drink and a few words to everyone, from the junior associates to the senior partners. Jacob looked almost giddy as he watched the judge approach the middle of the room. He whispered something to Ashley, his chest swelling with the pride of a man who believed the legend he was about to become. The judge moved with the kind of unhurried confidence that makes a room rearrange its own gravity. He worked his way toward the back, his eyes scanning faces with a sharp, judicial clarity. When he reached the perimeter, the area my family had designated as the safe distance for their embarrassment, he turned toward the service door. He reached my table, and for a half second, he started to offer a polite, generic smile. Then, he got a clear look at my face. He stopped so suddenly that the tray tilted in his hands. One of the crystal flutes gave a soft, sharp clink against another, a sound that seemed to ring through the entire silent dining room. He didn't look confused. He didn't look like a man trying to place a familiar face. He looked like he had just stumbled upon a monument in a dark alleyway. He set the tray down on the empty corner of my table and straightened his posture, instinct taking over, before his social grace could catch up. His voice, when it came, was not the casual tone of a dinner guest. It was the voice of the bench. It carried to every corner of the Metropolitan Club. "Ma'am, Professor Cole. I didn't realize you'd be here tonight." The room went still, in the way only rooms full of the highly trained and the highly wealthy can go still. It was an immediate, vacuum-like silence. Every head turned. My brother's face was the first I saw. The blood had drained out of him so quickly, he looked translucent. Jennifer and Michael looked like they had been struck by lightning, their mouths hanging open as the hierarchy they had spent 30 years building collapsed in a single sentence. I rose from my chair slowly, out of habit, and before I could say a word, Judge Miller reached for my hand with both of his. He gave me a respectful, professional greeting reserved for a peer, not a temp worker hidden by the kitchen. "It is a profound honor to finally meet you in person," he said, sounding genuinely caught off guard. "I have cited your reasoning in the Madisonian papers to 3 different committees this month. My clerks and I have spent hours dissecting your work. Why on earth are you sitting back here?" Jacob tried to speak, his voice coming out as a thin, mangled sound. He moved toward us, a weak smile forming and dying on his lips in the same breath. He said there had been some confusion with the seating chart, but the judge wasn't looking at the chart. He was looking at the character of the man standing next to it. Jacob stepped forward, his movements jerky, like a marionette with tangled strings. He tried to reclaim the narrative, telling Judge Miller that I was indeed modest, that I preferred the quiet of the back room while I performed my administrative filing. It was a desperate attempt to maintain the $1 million facade he had spent his life constructing. But Judge Miller's expression didn't soften, it sharpened into a blade. He reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a folded document. He explained that his security detail performs a standard background check on any close associates, especially those involved in high-value federal applications. He looked at the paper, then at Jacob, then at me. He asked if I was aware of the $1,500,000 federal grant application submitted in my name for a new research foundation, a foundation where Jacob was listed as the primary financial beneficiary. The room felt like it was shrinking. I walked toward the main table, my steps measured and audible in the absolute silence. I looked at the document. The signature at the bottom was a perfect imitation of my own, but the intent was a crime. He hadn't just forged a pen and ink signature, he had exploited the digital credentials I kept on our shared home computer, bypassing the federal verification system by posing as my authorized legal representative. I felt the room's oxygen vanish as I looked directly at Jacob, then turned to Judge Miller. When I spoke, my voice lost its narrative warmth and became a sharp, public declaration that echoed off the high ceilings. I had never seen that application. My brother forged my signature to access funds meant for my research, likely to pay off his massive debts right here at the club. I have already flagged this misappropriation with the Office of Inspector General. The federal government does not take kindly to those who treat research grants as a personal ATM. The silence that followed was lethal. It wasn't just a family lie anymore. It was a felony in a room full of federal officers. I saw Ashley's mother recoil, her face a mask of horror as she gripped her husband's arm. Judge Miller didn't even acknowledge Jacob's existence anymore. His eyes were cold as granite as he signaled the club's head of security with a single, dismissive wave. The social death of Jacob Cole was faster than any courtroom sentencing. Jacob looked like he was physically shrinking, his shoulders dropping as the charm that had sustained him for 28 years evaporated. This is the moment where the illusion of power meets the reality of an empty wallet. Jacob was a man who believed his status was something he owned, but it was really just a luxury he had been renting with my credit. People like him believe that if they look the part and speak the lines, the world will never look inside the safe. They don't understand that when the money disappears, character is the only thing left to hold up the ceiling. Jacob's identity was a rented suit, and the lease had just expired. He wasn't a rising star, he was a balance sheet, written in red ink. Ashley stood up then. She didn't scream or cry. She was a woman who had been raised to respect the law, and she had just realized she was about to marry a fraud. She looked at the ring on her finger, a symbol of a future that had been built on forgery and silence. She slid the platinum band off her finger and placed it on the white linen of the main table. The sound it made was a soft, sharp click, but in that silent room, it sounded like a gavel striking a final sentence. She stood and walked to my side of the table, turning her back on Jacob as if he had already ceased to be a living person in her world. She wasn't just leaving him, she was choosing the truth over the lie. She looked at Jacob and told him he didn't just lie to her, he had lied about the kind of man he was. She turned to me, her eyes full of a strange, grateful shock, and apologized for her part in the evening. I simply nodded. There was no room left for his performance. The lights were on, the audience had seen the wires, and the theater was closed. I didn't wait for the dessert course, or the final, hollow rounds of applause. I picked up my bag and walked toward the heavy brass doors of the lobby, my heels clicking against the marble with a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. I heard the frantic footsteps behind me before I reached the exit. "Madison, wait!" Jennifer's voice was no longer polished. It was thin and jagged with panic. Michael was right behind her, his face a mottled gray that matched the ruins of the evening. They cornered me near the valet stand, their eyes darting around as if looking for the social standing they had just dropped on the floor. "You have to fix this, Madison," Jennifer hissed, her fingers digging into my arm. "Jacob, the fallout. Judge Miller will destroy us if you don't tell him it was all a misunderstanding." "I don't tell lies for free anymore, Jennifer," I said, my voice level and cold. "The house. The bank sent the final foreclosure notice this morning. After 8 months of missed payments and unpaid property taxes, we've run out of appeals. If the full delinquency isn't settled by midnight, the sheriff will be at our door. We'll be on the street. You wouldn't do that to your own family, would you? I looked at them, and for the first time in 31 years, I didn't see the giants who had made me feel small. I saw two desperate people whose entire reality was built on the labor of a daughter they refused to claim. I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone. The screen glowed with the banking app I had opened at 11:51 p.m. I turned the screen toward them. There, in bold clinical text, was the confirmation: recurring payment to mortgage servicing canceled. Jennifer let out a small, strangled sound. You said it would be best if I sat in the back to keep things comfortable, Jennifer, I said, quoting the words she had used to humiliate me. Comfortable for whom? You never answered that. But I've decided it's time I became sensible. I'm finally being the daughter you always wanted, the one who stays in the back and doesn't cause any more trouble for your elite friends. Just for one evening. I stepped back, watching the realization hit them like a physical blow. The house, the club membership, the mountain of lies, it was all gone. They weren't losing their home because of my cruelty. They were losing it because they had treated their only foundation like an inconvenience. Goodbye, Jennifer. Goodbye, Michael. I walked out into the cold Washington, D.C. air and didn't look back. Behind me, the Metropolitan Club stood like a mausoleum for a performance that had finally ended. I felt a weight lift from my shoulders that I had been carrying since I was a child. The invisible scaffolding was gone, and for the first time in my life, I was standing on my own ground. The swearing-in ceremony happened on a Tuesday morning, in a ceremonial courtroom, flooded with sharp winter light. Judge David Miller was there, not as a witness to a lie, but as the man who had championed my nomination. I stood before the bench, the youngest woman ever appointed as special counsel to the First Circuit. I did not look for Jennifer or Michael in the gallery. I did not look for Jacob. They were not invited. They were not even told. The silence from them over the past few months had been a gift, a final payment on a debt I never truly owed. Jacob's legal troubles are ongoing. Forgery and fraud are not handled politely in the federal system. Jennifer and Michael lost the house 3 months ago. I heard they moved into a small rental on the outskirts of the city, still choosing to believe the lie that I was the one who failed them. But as I stood in my new office, looking out at the marble monuments of Washington, D.C., I realized that the view from the service door and the view from the bench are only different if you believe the person sitting at them is different. I have finally realized that my worth was never something they could grant or take away. It was the work I carried in my own hands. To anyone listening who has ever felt like the spare part of a family story, this is my letter to you. You are not a phase, you are not a burden, and you are certainly not an embarrassment. Sometimes, the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones most terrified of your potential. They want you to stay small because your growth forces them to confront their own stagnation. If you are currently sitting at the back of the room, near the service door, do not be discouraged. Use that time to watch. Use it to build your foundation in the dark. Because when the truth finally steps into the light, you will not need an invitation to the main table. You will have built a table of your own. Forgiveness is not always about the other person. Sometimes it is the quiet act of setting yourself free from their expectations. You have value right now, exactly where you are, even if no one in your house has the eyes to see it yet. If this story reminded you of your own strength, please hit the like button and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Don't forget to subscribe for more journeys of justice and self-worth. Thank you for being part of our community.